Hi again. Okay, so tonight we're going to work with biological classification. So up to this point, we've looked at what makes something living versus non-living. Now we have all these living things, and there are millions and millions of living things. Well, how do we put them in some sort of order so that we can understand what is more related to what and how they are related? In order to do that, we use a classification system. So here in italics you can see, to work with the diversity of life, we need a system, a biological classification that names and orders organisms in a logical manner. So what are some things that we need for this classification? Well, here are two characteristics. One is to assign a universally accepted name to each organism. What do I mean by universally? Universally means that the way that someone in the United States does it will be exactly the same way as someone in China or India or Zaire or England. That we all use the same classification system and give that name that we all understand. So that's one of the things we need, and that's why Latin is used as the common language that we all use for this classification system. So for instance, if I'm talking about soybeans and I say glycine max, glycine is the genus, max is the species, and that naming way of naming is going to work no matter what country I am in around the world. Also, I can place organisms into groups that have real biological meanings. We are able to figure a lot out about the world because of genetics today. And so we can put these organisms into groups by their genetic relatedness. And so we will be looking at these relationships. So, some things to think about with classification. We have common names versus scientific names. Now I just gave the example of soybean. Soybean is a common name. If I were in Japan, that would be edamame. If I was in China, that would be dado. And even other parts of China might call it something else. Different countries have different names for the same thing, and even different regions within a country may call a particular plant, animal, fungi, different things. So in order to help with that problem, we have scientific names. And the scientific name is in Latin, and it's the same from country to country. It's universally accepted. We have a classification system, which goes from most general characteristics all shared by a group of organisms until we narrow it down and we can tell you exactly which species we're talking about. And then we have kingdoms that reflect the origin of life, and we're going to talk a little bit about those kingdoms. So here are some common names. Human, red-legged frog, Komodo dragon, lodgepole pine tree, dog, lungwort, which is kind of lichen, or chanterelle mushrooms. These are all names that you probably recognize because they're all in English, but they aren't necessarily what these are called commonly in other countries around the world. So, when we add the scientific name, this is our next slide. So for human, for instance, notice the genus is Homo, the species is Sapien, and all of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the fact that humans are genus and species Homo sapien. Red-legged frog. Frogs all share that genus Rana. You can see R-A-N-A. Rana is the genus name for frog. But if we want to know the red-legged frog, that specific common name, that would be Rana aurora. You can see that with E. coli bacteria. The E. coli actually refers to the genus and species name, the E being Escheri or Escheri, and the coli being coli. And as you can see down throughout this list, you have a common name that is further delineated by the genus and species that it's been given. Well, where does this come from? This type of naming that we saw in the previous slide is called and you can see the title here, Binomial Nomenclature. Binomial nomenclature. Binomial refers to bi means two, like a bicycle has two wheels. Nomial refers to name, so binomial having two names. These all have a genus and a species. Those are the two names. Nomenclature refers to names. Again, it's a little redundant. Nomen is another way of getting to names. This type of naming system was developed by Carolus Linnaeus. Carolus Linnaeus, very famous botanist. Now, Carolus Linnaeus, that actually was not his real name, but he gave himself a Latin name, just like we've given all these other organisms Latin names, so that he could be part of his naming system. This is an international system accepted around the world, and one wonderful thing about science is that if you enjoy doing things and working with people from all over the world, science is a place where we do that a lot. And what he did is he grouped organisms by their body structure. So he just looked at, what do you look like? Do you look like a butterfly? Butterfly. Do you look more like a elephant, or do you look more like a moth? Oh, you look more like a moth. Let's put the moths and the butterflies together. And then he started grouping these things by just how they looked, by their body structure. And he developed groups, which he called taxa. Okay, and as you got these groups going, that would be a certain taxa or group. And that led to the science of taxonomy. Taxonomy is the science of naming and grouping organisms. And even today, taxonomists are a very important part of identifying what species currently exist and where they exist. And just recently, a new species was found in Peru, I believe. And so but if the taxonomy had not been done, we wouldn't know that's a new species. So it's a way of understanding the organization of living things. So here is the taxonomy order that we use. We go from the largest, that includes the most amount of organisms and contains a large number, down to the most specific. So let's look at what that means. Domain. Domain, there are 3 domains. There's bacteria, archaebacteria, and then after the bacteria and the archaebacteria, there is one other. So those are our 3 domains. Then we have our kingdoms, and so that domain that I didn't mention is called eukarya, and we'll get into that later. But there's plants and animals and fungi and protozoas, which are 4 of the kingdoms, all belong to eukarya. Okay, so that narrows it down even more. And then we narrow it down even more, and we put it in phylum, then into class, and then into order, then to family, to genus and species. So in binomial nomenclature, notice we only use the most specific naming devices to do those names, genus and species. We'll cover this all later in the term in more detail, but I do want you to be familiar with it because it'll come up again and again in examples. So here we go. If we're taking a red-legged frog, it belongs to the domain Eukarya. It belongs to the kingdom Animalia because it's an animal. Then it belongs to the phylum Chordata. Chordata is referring to the spinal cord. Of course, frogs have spinal cords, just like we do. We also belong to the phylum Chordata. So we are in the same phylum as human beings as frogs. However, we are not in the class Amphibia because we are mammals, and so they are in the class Amphibia because they are amphibians living both in water and on land. They're in the order Anura, family Ranidae, genus Rana, and species Aurora, and it gets narrow and more narrow. You might notice that the genus and species are both in italics, and that is because when you write a genus and species name in binomial nomenclature, you will notice that they are always written in italics and or underlined. The other thing you will notice is that the genus is in capital letters to start. The first letter is capitalized, and the species is not. You always have to write the genus with the species. I repeat, you always have to write the genus with the species. They have to be together. They have to be italicized, and they have to have the genus is with one capital and the species is not capitalized. Okay, so those are some of the naming rules. If this has gone too fast, rewind this section and make sure that you do catch those rules. Write them down 1, 2, 3. But how are these groupings made? Let's think about this for a second. So how the groupings are made is by closely related things that are closely related and are classified together. If things have analogous structures, they may belong to different groups. For example, in the picture there, you have a pterodactyl wing, a bat wing, and a bird wing. Well, the bat wing and the bird wing, even though they do have some similar structures, they actually do not. They were derived separately. They are not from the same lineage. Bats, of course, are mammals, and birds are aves, so they're from very distantly related groups, and so that difference is reflected in how we name them. The other thing we look at are biochemical similarities. In other words, their genetics. Is the DNA and the RNA similar? And when we look at DNA, we can really figure out where things have branched off and what has happened and how long this has taken. So again, here is the way that we can look at nomenclature. We go from the largest being domain, then kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. In the colored diagram, it's flipped over, and the reason it's flipped over the other way is that you go from it's going from the most specific to the least specific there. So that's how that diagram is working in that bit. So just to give you an indication of how this looks, we have this 3-domain system. Look at the middle bar in your diagram here. Notice the 3-domain system. That's letter B. Bacteria is one domain, archaea is another domain, and eukarya is another domain. Take a second to write those down so that you're familiar with them. Then, from that perspective, now we're able to break it into kingdoms. Now the kingdom number has changed over time. When I was a kid, we were on a 5-kingdom system, but since then they found that there's greater genetic disparity between just bacteria and archaean bacteria. Look where in A, where it says Monera, that's the old system. Okay, so if you look at an old book, or maybe you've seen some old stuff, it might use that name. That in modern times, with the development of superior genetic techniques, has been divided into the bacterial kingdom and the archaebacteria kingdom. So now those are separate. Then within eukarya, okay, we have 4 kingdoms. We have the Protista, which is sometimes we give another names, but Protista, Plantae, which of course are plants, Plantae, Fungi, which are fungi, your mushrooms and yeast and things like that, and Animalia. Yes, I bet you guessed it. Yes, it is animals. So that's what those refer to. Later on, we'll be talking about what some examples of these, because there's some really cool examples in all of these that we'll be working with. So that is all we're going to do for now, and this should be just kind of an intro into how the groups in which we break up organisms.